The day the millionaire's son was born, the city's most expensive private hospital fell unnaturally silent, as if even the walls understood the weight of what had just happened. Because Alejandro Whitmore was not just rich, he was untouchable, a man whose name opened doors, silenced rooms and bent outcomes. And when the doctor finally cleared his throat and said the words, "Your son was born," deaf, the air seemed to collapse inward. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the blanket around the baby, tears sliding down her cheeks while Alejandro remained frozen, his expression carved from disbelief and quiet rage. Because this was not the future he had purchased with decades of ruthless ambition. He had imagined a son who would speak at podiums, negotiate boardrooms, inherit empires, not a child who lived in silence. And as days passed, the diagnosis was confirmed again and again by the best specialists money could buy. No miracle, no mistake, no reversal, just a permanent truth Alejandro refused to accept. So he buried himself in work and left the mansion colder than before, while Sophia faded into quiet grief, and the baby, little Daniel, grew surrounded by luxury but starved of connection. Caregivers rotated like shifts, specialists came and went, but no one truly saw him, except Rosa, the maid, a woman who arrived every morning before sunrise, with tired hands and a gentle soul, who noticed how Daniel's eyes followed vibrations, how he responded to touch, how his small fingers gripped hers as if pleading to be understood. And while the house dismissed her as invisible, Rosa began speaking to Daniel anyway, softly, slowly, exaggerating her lips, using gestures she remembered from her childhood village where a deaf cousin had lived. She hummed so he could feel the vibration against her chest. She tapped rhythms on the floor. She smiled until her face hurt, and little by little Daniel smiled back. But when Alejandro discovered this, his anger erupted. He accused Rosa of false hope, of overstepping, of wasting time, warning her that this house paid for obedience, not fantasies. Yet Rosa did not stop, because some instincts are stronger than fear. And as months passed, Daniel began responding in ways doctors had said were impossible, not hearing but understanding, connecting, expressing. And though Alejandro refused to acknowledge it, something unseen was changing, something that would soon shatter every belief he had ever held. The moment everything changed came on an ordinary afternoon, when the Whitmore family hosted a gathering of investors and elites, the mansion filled with polished laughter and expensive lies. And Daniel, now 3 years old, sat quietly in the corner as always, until Rosa, knowing Alejandro despised public embarrassment, hesitated only a second before, kneeling beside the boy and placing his tiny hands on her throat. She spoke slowly, deliberately, signing and mouthing words together, and then she did something no one expected. She stepped into the center of the room and gently guided Daniel forward. The crowd fell silent as she gestured for him to try. And in that moment, Daniel looked at his father, really looked at him, and for the first time signed a sentence so clear it stunned the room. "I know you're my father," and gasps rippled through the guests. Sophia covered her mouth in disbelief. Doctors froze, and Alejandro felt something crack deep inside his chest. Because his son, the one he had emotionally abandoned, had just communicated publicly, powerfully, without sound. And Rosa explained calmly that deafness was not silence, that the boy's mind was brilliant, that he had simply needed someone to believe in him. And the humiliation Alejandro feared turned into revelation. Tears filled his eyes as he knelt before his son, realizing his wealth had failed where compassion had succeeded. And from that day forward, everything changed. Alejandro learned sign language, funded programs for deaf children, publicly acknowledged Rosa as the woman who saved his son's future, and Daniel grew into a confident child who later stood on stages, not to speak but to inspire, proving that limitations exist only where love is absent. Months passed, and the Whitmore mansion, once cold and sterile, began to hum with warmth that had nothing to do with money. Alejandro, who had spent years chasing control and perfection, now found himself humbled by the quiet power of love and persistence. He watched Rosa guide Daniel through games that taught him more than any tutor ever could. Every gesture, every sign, every laugh that erupted from the boy filled the house with a kind of joy Alejandro had never purchased. And as the media began to hear whispers of the miracle child, journalists gathered at the mansion, cameras flashing, but it was Rosa who remained the hero in every story, her humility untouched by fame, while Alejandro learned to step back, to listen, to really see his son. Realizing that power without empathy was meaningless, Daniel blossomed under her guidance, learning to communicate with a confidence that left doctors stunned and guests in awe. And one evening, when Alejandro returned home exhausted from a meeting, he found Daniel sitting on the grand staircase, carefully signing a story he had invented himself, his tiny fingers moving gracefully, and Alejandro knelt beside him. Feeling a lump in his throat he could not swallow, realizing that the real wealth of life was not in assets or influence, but in moments like these, in human connection, in the courage of someone like Rosa, who refused to ignore what others deemed impossible. And as he hugged his son tightly, Alejandro whispered a promise he would keep forever, that he would never let fear or pride block the path of love again. And the mansion, once a place of cold power, now rang with laughter, learning, and hope, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles are born, not from wealth, but from the heart of a humble soul who dared to care. The turning point came on the day of Daniel's 4th birthday, a day Alejandro had initially planned as a display of wealth, with golden balloons, a luxury cake, and guests in designer suits. But it became a celebration of the heart instead, because Rosa had secretly organized a small corner of the garden where Daniel could play and interact with children from a nearby school for deaf kids, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of music. And Alejandro, watching from the veranda, felt an unfamiliar warmth, seeing his son communicate effortlessly, signing stories, laughing, and even teaching other children. And when Daniel noticed his father observing him, he ran up and signed, "Look, Daddy, I can share." And Alejandro's eyes filled with tears, for he understood that true legacy was not about empires or money, but about nurturing the soul of a child. In that moment, Alejandro knelt, embraced Daniel tightly, and whispered a gratitude he could not have learned from any business lesson. He looked at Rosa, who stood quietly in the background, her face glowing with modest pride, and realized she had done what no wealth or influence could. She had given his son a voice, a confidence, and a life filled with possibilities. And the room, once a place of silent tension, now rang with joy and amazement. Guests applauded, some even crying at the miraculous transformation. And Alejandro knew the world would never forget what had happened, that miracles often come from those we least expect. And Rosa, who had risked everything to simply care, became the hero of the story, while Daniel, once silenced by fate, now thrived, proving that love, patience, and courage can overcome any obstacle. And as the party ended and the sun set over the mansion, Alejandro took Daniel's hand and signed back the first words he had ever learned. "I love you." And Daniel's eyes sparkled, a silent promise passing between them that no wealth, no power, nothing could ever break. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that small actions can create unimaginable miracles, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because stories like Daniel's teach us that humanity, kindness, and courage are priceless, and they deserve to be shared with the world.